I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you in the next few minutes about the changes that take place in your life. The one thing that we know to be true is the change is inevitable. It's inevitable in every human life, in every experience. And the way that we accept change can determine how it is we feel about life. We can welcome it and embrace it, or we can fight it and we can try to avoid it. But no matter what we do, change will come into our lives. It never is important what is happening outside of us. The true importance is what's happening inside us. And so as changes come into our lives, into your life and into my life, we're challenged to know within ourselves that we can deal with the changes that come, with the challenges that come. Outside events will change forever. Everything in our life is changing. If we simply look in the mirror in the morning, we can see that our physical bodies change as we age. They change based upon how we feel. The people around us change based upon what's going on in their life, what has happened in their past experience. All of the things that we see in the outer world are constantly changing. The seasons change. Everything that we know and believe to be constant in our life will be moved and will be changed. And so our challenge is to deal with the changes in life inside us, not to deal with the externals, but to deal with the externals in an internal way. In New Thought, in metaphysical philosophy, we talk about the fact that we live in our minds and not in the world. What that means is that the way that we think about the things that take place in our lives determine the quality and fiber of our being. We can be happy or sad based not necessarily upon what takes place outside in our lives, but what happens inside us and the way that we think about what happens within us. In New Thought, we use affirmations. Affirmations are statements of spiritual reality, not things that we're seeking after, not something that we want to come into our life, but an affirmation is a positive statement of spiritual reality. They are usually short statements, if they are most meaningful, and as we use them, we can write them, we can read them, but best of all, we can say them. And if we use affirmations, we believe that we begin the process of reconditioning our conscious mind, that is our thought process, speaking to and giving information to our subconscious mind. And as our subconscious mind changes, then when our conscious mind draws upon information that we have within the subconscious, our thought process changes. I'd like to share with you a simple affirmation. The affirmation is, I am willing to be changed. I am willing to be changed. I am willing to be changed. I am is described in the Bible as the description of God. Whenever we say, I am, we talk about the real essence of who we are and ourselves united with the divine presence of God. When we say, I am willing, we are open. And when we say, I am willing to be changed, we are opening ourselves to the reality that we can be changed. Whatever happens outside may or may not change. But if we are willing to be changed, we change our way of thinking, we change what's happening inside of us. The events of life come to teach us, to give us a spiritual reality and dimension. And as we have said before, and as we teach again within New Thought and within metaphysical philosophy, the experiences of life are really the school of the soul. And so each day, each thought, each experience that you have and that I have are here to teach us spiritual lessons, to feed our spirit and our soul. And so the lessons that we learn sometimes are painful, sometimes are difficult, but it is through the process of change that we learn the lessons that we need to understand, comprehend, and embrace in our spiritual growth and in our spiritual life and dimension. So often when changes come into our lives, we want to ask, or we do ask why. We ask why this has happened. If we lose a job, we may ask why. If we come into a time of illness, we ask why. If someone passes into spirit and dies in this world, we ask why. If difficult times come into our being, we ask why. Whenever we ask why, we're never really seeking after an answer. We're really laying the groundwork for an argument or a fight. And what we want to do when we say why so often is we don't want to understand. We don't really want to understand. We want to argue with the reality of whatever the experience is. In a tragic situation when someone passes away, we want to know why they died. Why did this happen to them? Why does this have to happen to me? If there's a divorce or a separation, the why question comes. If there isn't enough money to pay the bills, we ask why. And in the asking of why, we're not really seeking an answer. We want to argue with ourselves about what has happened. We want to justify it in some way. And as we argue with ourselves, we step out of the hurt and out of the pain. But we don't change. The circumstance doesn't change. And we have chosen to make a change within ourselves that is less than positive. What we need to do in the midst of change is not ask why, but simply ask what. What is it that I need to do now? What is it that I need to do to be guided and directed in the right way, in the new way, in the direction that I should move? Because this is where I am. Change is real. Change is reality. And in the midst of our reality, in the midst of our real experience, we don't need the experience to change. We need our thoughts to change. We need to be willing to be changed within ourselves. What an empowering concept and idea. If in the midst of every challenge of life, you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that you could be changed, not that the circumstance could be changed, that you could be changed. And the power and the grace of God within you allows you and empowers you and strengthens you to exactly that point. You can be changed. You can change your way of thinking anytime you choose. No one has the power to depress you. No one has the power to hurt you. No one has the power to separate you from where you want to be, from the unions that you want to have, but you have that power. If you get angry, it is because you allow yourself to become angry. If I become angry, it is because I allow myself to become angry. I allow something to take place within me, and I then give power, the power within me, over to the circumstance and the situation. Aside from asking why, we have very inquisitive minds. As human beings, we want to know the meaning. We want to know the cause. As spiritual and religious people, we also fall into that trap. So often in counseling, when we talk to people who are dealing with serious illnesses, or people who are dealing with perhaps a condition of cancer or heart disease, the question from very faithful spiritual people is, why has this happened to me? What is the cause of it? What did I do? What has brought this upon me? And again, it is a questioning that takes us out of the experience and allows the thought process within us to move in a negative way that is immersed, rather than dealing with the circumstance of the situation, immersed in the idea that perhaps if we can get away from it, we can change it. We don't need to understand the meaning. We don't need to understand the cause. In some cases, we spend a lot of time that should be spent in dealing with the change of our mind, the acceptance of where we are, and the movement from there into a new realm of experience or life. We will not always understand the cause. The causes of our life experiences are a combination of events, some of which we have control over, and others over which we have little or no control. So we don't need to know the cause. We don't need to know the meaning, and we certainly don't need to know the why of all of the events and changes in our lives. But what we do need to do is to embrace the concept of change and understand that change is a process. It is a process. It is not an event, it is a process. And the process moves from one point to another point to another point. It moves from the point of the experience to the point of reaffirmation of the reality and into a new direction or guidance. That process takes us through life, through the experiences, and it teaches us that we are going and growing through each of the changes that come into our lives. I don't know what change you will face in your life. I don't know what changes and challenges you're facing today, but I do know that every one of us will continually face change, that our physical being will change, our relationships will change, our financial situations will change, the world in which we live will change. And in the midst of this inevitable change, the important point is always what happens within us. And I invite you to affirm with me, I am willing to be changed. Allow yourself to be changed and not the events of life. And when you open yourself, when I open myself, when we open ourselves to be changed, we open ourselves to be changed in the way that we think about the external changes that have taken place in our lives. And when we open ourselves to a newness of life, when we open ourselves to be changed, the power and grace and infinite wisdom of the divine will guide and direct us in ways that we would and could have never imagined. We believe in prayer as a centering force and as a empowering force within our being. And so we'd like to pause at this point in the program and invite you to join with us in a reflection and in a prayer. Eternal God, we gather our hearts and minds together in the thankfulness that we have for the process of change. We embrace the process and the concept of change, and we make it a part of our life. We accept it as a reality, and in the midst of that changing reality, we claim and know your divine presence in this process. We know and pray these things in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
The theme of your talk just now on the process of change is so wonderful, because if we could take that to heart, then we would accept every change in our life as being a positive factor, and not something that we would just say, why me, Lord, but we would say, what am I supposed to learn from this change?
Very important. That why me, Lord,
yes.
takes up so much of our time. And if we spend more and more time saying, why me, Lord, we lose self-esteem, we lose precious time, we lose vision, and we separate ourselves more and more from God, because we're looking for the reason instead of accepting the reality of where we are.
And in separating ourselves from God, we're not learning anything. We're just at a status quo. So we need to know why the change. And very often we can ask in meditation for deeper insight into that particular event, and it will come. And then we grow from that. We don't just stay static.
Mm-hmm. And that's important. The changes in life create for us opportunities of growth.
Yes.
And if we never had change, and of course, as human beings, we're so resistant to change, and that's true for every one of us. And there are just some who are better at accepting change, and some who are more willing to change within themselves. And those are people who are farther along in the spiritual trek. And they're also, interestingly, the people who we look at and say, my goodness, how can they deal with so many problems? How can they deal so beautifully with life? And we think that maybe they're smarter, or maybe they're better educated, or maybe they're luckier. And in reality, all that's happened is they're people who are willing to be changed within themselves and not worry about what happens outside.
Yes, and what they're doing is growing through that change. They're not staying static, because if they stay static, then more things happen because they've not learned that lesson. Mm-hmm. And I learned a very wonderful lesson recently. I've been asking for many years why my 3-year-old daughter died in 1955, and new information was given to me which made sense, perfect sense, that it was in other lives I had been too bitter and too resentful when those I loved died, so I had to not love less but release more. And when those changes happened to the people I loved, then I had to accept the will of God, not my will, but thine be done, oh God, in me and through me. And when that information came to me recently, it was so clear. And I was so pleased that I had asked, not my will, but thine be done, oh God, in me and through me, instead of resisting, and tried to see what the reason was, and not to love God any less, but to love God more, because now my daughter is on the inner planes of being, and so then I would love more. And so actually that's one lesson I came in, and that was a primary lesson I came into this life to learn, and it's a pity that it took me so many years to learn it.
And so many of the lessons that we learn are tremendously painful.
Yes.
Losing a child, as you did, when she was at such a young age, and those experiences are not experiences that we would with our conscious mind choose,
Yes.
although we know that many of these experiences are chosen because of the agreements that we make when we enter this life
Yes.
experience. But that the truth is, just as you shared so beautifully, the will of God is always there, and that will never changes. God's will for you or for your daughter didn't change because she lived or she passed into spirit.
Yes.
God's feeling for you and for that child is exactly the same. God never changes.
Exactly.
And we change, and our experiences change, but if we would just allow ourselves, our thoughts to be changed, we would know that in every experience there is a wonderful and beautiful lesson, even if we have to cry.
Yes, and it's good to cry because it washes away the tension and the bitterness, and the tears are cleansing. And I know recently someone very precious to me was faced with something life-threatening, and it was very hard for me not to cry, and I cried a lot. Because if you love someone, then you're going to cry if you think you're not going to see them. But when this information was given to me more since that time, then I could see that no, I wasn't holding resentment. I was just shedding tears of sadness that I wouldn't get to see that person again in physical form. And so it wasn't a blot on my record, on my growth, because it's the resentment we feel, it's the intent in our heart that makes the big difference. So if our intent is to hold tightly to that person and say why me and why that person that I loved, instead of that modality, to say yes, this person was so wonderful and I loved that one and I'm glad they shared my life, regardless of what relationship it might be, but then to be able to release and to know that that person is going on to fulfill their destiny, their own destiny. And yes, we'll miss them, but grief is selfish. And so, but it's normal to cry. It's normal to wash away those tensions and the poison that's within us.
It's normal to cry, it's normal to grieve, it's normal to be hurt, it's normal even in some cases to be angry.
Yes.
But in the midst of those emotions, what we want to do always is to get away from what the arguments would be and get away from the thinking. Just in your case, when you cried, as you said so well, for a variety of reasons, but a part of you wanted the situation not to change, not to be the way it is. But the change, had that person made a transition, it would have been for the best of that person and for your best spiritual understanding. And so it is not to resist.
It's so hard to say goodbye, but we can, that's not a choice. If we have to say goodbye, we have to say goodbye. But we do have the choice of how we do it. If we do it with love in our hearts or if we do it with resentfulness, and there's the difference.
And the changes will come. And the inevitability of change is something, and as we've said so often in our discussions and also in talks at the church, if there's one thing that God wants us to get good at, it has to be change. Because everything about us changes, and nothing is constant, at least that we can see in the physical. And part of that is that God is teaching us that what we see in the physical is transient. And we all know that within us is an ageless, youthful, dynamic, powerful spirit. And of course, the clearest way that I've seen that in my life is as we talk to people who are at the end of their life, who have led long lives. Universally, people will say to me, here they've been debilitated, ill, they're 80, 90 years old, and they'll say, you know, I just can't believe when I look in the mirror that it's me because I don't feel old. And that's the spiritual dimension. That is the reality of life, beckoning to them the truth. And the truth is that we don't age, we don't change, but the physical changes, and we need to embrace that.
Yes, and drop it, and to know that when we do die, when the physical body dies and we make that transition, then we're going to be the age we want to be. And if we liked being 20, that's what we will be. If we liked being 30, and so forth. Whatever age we wanted to be, because that's, and we can manifest that while we're still here on earth to a very great extent.
And many people do, and we've all seen people who are very youthful in old age.
Yes,
and,
that's true.
And of course, youth is to a great extent a dynamic of mind. So a young mind.
Yes, I can remember when I thought 70 was ancient. The Ancient of Days was not much older. And now I don't feel that way. And I can remember when I thought 25, well, 21. And don't we all have those ideas in our minds? So age is so relative, and it's how we live our lives that count. And it's not having the negativity expressed in our thoughts and in our lives. And it's our thoughts that are important, that we, like you teach so well, we live in our minds. And if our intent is to learn and grow, that's what we will do when we face those through the process of change. But if our intent is to be self-centered and just think of self, the little self, then we're not going to face the changes gracefully.
And of course, that important teaching that is fundamental to our belief system is that thoughts create. That everything that is in life was created by the power of mind, and that this entire world, if we look at the book of Genesis, was created out of a thought. God thought it into existence. God called it out of nothingness. And so do we call out of nothingness. But as we call in our thoughts, we create. And if those thoughts, if the process of our mind is negative, if it is bent upon not accepting change, if it draws to us negative influence and the thought process is negative, then the creative power within us is negative, and we will create a negative, a hurtful, and painful life for ourselves and for those who come in contact with us.
Exactly, and its release and detach are so very important, because God doesn't punish, God is love, but each person comes in with specific life plans, and then as they fulfill their destiny on the planet, whether it's to die at a specific age, younger than those who love them would like them to, or whether it's to do a certain work, whatever it is, well, they're coming from their own inner core. If they're happy and youthful and vibrant, then they're living the life according to their pre-planning.
Mm-hmm. And very important for us to understand that planning goes on, and that the experiences don't have to do with anything that God is doing.
Exactly.
They have to do with what's going on in us. And we create the change. We create the judgment. We bring that process in.
And rightly so, because that's why we're here on earth, to grow through certain things and to work through certain karma and to experience certain things so that we grow in character and in growth, spiritual growth. And it's an ever onward and upward journey. And I believe it is onward and upward, because I think we have evolved into a better species. And people talk about all the cruel things that are happening in the world, and it's true, there are cruel, horrible things happening in the world, but I think there's less than there ever was. And people are more in touch with their own spiritual core within today than other lives and other times. So that part is the important part. It's how we view life in a spiritual sense. And more people are viewing in a more spiritual way and more all-inclusive way.
Mm-hmm. And viewing the changes that take place
Yes.
in life, and really relishing the changes in many cases. So we can, of course, relish the positive changes in our life, but the challenge is to also be able to, if we can't relish them, at least be able to be objective in our view of the negative changes.
Yes. And just to know that the process of change, as you said so very well, is an essential part of our growth. And if we didn't have it, we wouldn't be fulfilling our destiny on the planet, and there wouldn't be any reason to be here if we were not going to be processing various changes in our lives from time to time.
And the changes are process, and that's exactly one of the points that we were making in the talk, that it is a process. Change is not an experience that punctuates,
Yes.
It is a process, and our acceptance of change is a process.
And then what we do with that is the important part. It's just like with the death of someone we love. If we spend our time grieving the rest of that lifetime, we're not processing.
Mm-hmm. And we stop the process.
Yes.
And if we stop the process, we're going to remain in the experience.
Yes.
And so often people remain in experiences. You've heard me tell the story often about the lady who came for counseling, and
Yes.
she had told me about how unhappy her marriage was and how terrible it was, and she was just so wounded and hurt. And after we talked several times, it was clear that she wasn't moving from the point of where she had been hurt, and she wasn't processing the change, wasn't going through it. But she said something to me that kind of triggered an idea that something wasn't that current. And the divorce had taken place many years before. And here I'd been counseling with her, believing that the divorce had taken place in just the very recent past. But she hadn't gotten out of the experience, and it was so vivid, and she had stopped the process, that even when she shared it with me, it was clear to my perception that it was something that was happening in the now. And of course, for her, it was happening in the now.
Because she never got beyond the first stages of the grief of that separation. And so, and she wasn't fulfilling what she needed to fulfill in order to live a wholesome, healthy, productive life and go on to other things later.
Yes, it's been said so eloquently that too many people live in the waiting room of life. And of course, if we spend all of our time in the waiting room, we never have an experience. And of course, then we end up with a life at the end where we're very sad and disheartened because of what we have missed.
Yes. Of course, the secret is in staying attuned to God the whole. And if we're able to stay attuned to God, then we can face those changes and use them as stepping stones. But if we get too involved within the little self within and not the God self and God the whole, then we're in trouble because we're just we're glued to the earth. We're not soaring in heaven ever.
Mhm. And that small self that you're talking about, I think, is an important concept for people to understand the difference between our physical being and our physical life and our physical self versus our higher self.
Yes. Well, the little self is the physical aspect of life, and then the soul. We have 7 bodies, and then the soul and the Adonai and the monad being the God's part within us. And if we can live from that aspect of our own being, and each person has that aspect in his own beinghood, then we're living the life as we were meant to have lived it, because we're living in a spiritually oriented way. And what religion we adhere to has no importance there. It's how we're attuned to God the whole.
Mhm. And that has to do also with the way in which we accept the changes that come to life. Because if we look at changes from the small self
Yes.
or the physical self, then we are never able to grow from them and to detach from them.
Yes, that's the poor me, why me syndrome, and looking at everything too personally instead of the overall view.
Mhm. And having that overall view and understanding that connectiveness that we have with God empowers us to deal with the changes that come into our
Yeah.
lives and to deal with the process.
In a sense, it's just having faith, a spiritual faith, undergirding ourselves with the faith that sustains us through any problems of life, or not having faith, and what do we fall back on then?
Mhm.
We don't have anything to fall back on without the faith.
And it is our faith and the presence of faith that empowers us and strengthens us to be at union with the God whom we love so much. And Reverend Freelander and I have been sharing with you some concepts and ideas in accepting the process of change. And we hope that you found this information useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart. Confident living helps me expand visions of value the kingdom at hand. Confident living, talent to win, gift of the Spirit moves from within. Confident living.